My father's workshop always smelled faintly of cedar, formaldehyde, and something I couldn't name, something old, almost alive. I used to sit in the corner as a kid, watching him work, mesmerized by the way he could make lifeless creatures look as if they might blink at any moment. Every mount, every glassy eye, every stitched seam was perfect. But perfection has its shadows, and I learned that too late. The last time I saw him working in that room, it was silent, except for the soft scrape of his tools and the occasional click of the clock on the wall. He didn't speak much, but I didn't need him to. I could feel the intensity in the air, the way his hands moved over the form, as though coaxing something hidden to life. That night, he whispered to himself, a low murmur that sounded almost like a prayer or a warning. I thought I was going to sleep upstairs, but something pulled me back down, a faint creaking, a soft thud, like a heartbeat echoing through the floorboards. I froze. My father wasn't supposed to hear me there, and yet the room felt alive with a presence I couldn't explain. And then I saw it, just for a second, shadow moving where it shouldn't, a shape on the table that didn't belong to any animal I'd ever seen. I ran back to my room, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever my father had created that night was watching, waiting, and not entirely dead. I haven't told anyone this before, not even my mother, who left long ago. But I need you to hear this. I need someone to understand, because what he made that night, it wasn't just taxidermy. It was something else entirely. I haven't told anyone this before. Not my friends, not a single coworker, not even my therapist, if you can believe I went to one. I suppose part of me feared the way people would look at me, like I was insane. Like I'd let childhood stories of taxidermy obsession twist into something monstrous in my mind. But that night, in that workshop, what I saw, it doesn't leave you. And I can't keep it bottled inside anymore. I just need someone to listen. You seem like someone who's seen strange things too, or at least someone who won't dismiss what I'm about to say. That's why I'm telling you now. There's no lighthearted way to frame this. There's no funny story about my dad's hobby ending. Because when you see what I saw, when you feel the weight of something that shouldn't exist, yet does, you understand that reality isn't as simple as we pretend it is. I was 24, living alone in a small apartment in the outskirts of town. My father's house had long since been sold, but his workshop remained as it always had, a shrine to dead things and perfect illusions. I visited it sometimes, when the city became too noisy and I needed silence. But I never went back after that night. Not until, well, I'll get to that. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not after the creaking, not after the shadow. I kept thinking about those lifeless glassy eyes, about the subtle movements that seemed to defy explanation. You know the feeling, the hairs on the back of your neck standing up. The room suddenly too cold, a sense that something unseen is watching you. That's what it was like. Every tick of the clock, every whisper of the wind outside, it all seemed charged with awareness. And yet I couldn't tell anyone. Who would believe it? I remember pacing the apartment, unable to shake the sense of being followed, though I lived alone. Creepy noises echoed from corners I knew were empty. Shadows stretched longer than they should. The presence lingered even in my memories, haunting me during sleepless nights. And I couldn't stop thinking about the workshop, about what my father had been doing, about what he had finally made before he died. I just need you to understand, this isn't paranoia. This isn't me imagining things. Some things exist that don't make sense. Some creations, some last creations, are more than art. They carry intent, consciousness, something lurking just beneath the surface of what we perceive. And when I think of that night, I remember the eyes. Not just the eyes of his creatures, but the eyes of that one thing, watching, alive, aware, waiting. I've tried to bury the memory, tried to focus on work, on friends, on normal life. But there's a hollowness, a subtle pull I can't ignore. Every night, in the quiet hours, I feel it. like a soft brush across my arm, a faint exhale behind my ear. I start to wonder if it followed me, if it left the workshop when I ran, if it learned something in the darkness. Promise me you won't try to find it. Don't think you can explore my father's workshop. Don't think you can uncover what was hidden beneath dust and shadow. Some doors are not meant to be opened. Some creations are not meant to be understood. You may think curiosity is harmless, but it isn't. Curiosity has a cost, and that cost, I fear it's irreversible. I've spent years trying to convince myself that what I experienced was a trick of light, an overactive imagination, the natural exaggeration of memory. But I know better. I know because there are things in the world that refuse to stay dead. Things that linger long after their creators are gone. Things that watch silently from corners of rooms, waiting. And that's why I'm telling you now. Because if I don't, the weight of it will crush me completely. You need to know that even the most familiar place is your childhood home. A workshop filled with memories can hide things you aren't meant to see. Things that, once observed, don't let go. I haven't been able to sleep properly since. I still wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced I hear the faint scrape of claws or the shuffle of footsteps where no one should be. Some nights, I think about going back, to confront it, to see if the shadows were real, to prove to myself that it's all in my mind. But I can't, and neither should you. There is a line between curiosity and self-destruction, and once it's crossed, you don't come back the same. So, I'm telling you this, whispering it into the dark, not to frighten you, not for thrill, but because you need to understand what it feels like to be alone with a creation that shouldn't exist, to feel the weight of something watching you, even when you think you're safe, even when you're far away. And maybe, if you listen closely, you'll understand the unspoken rule my father lived by, the one he never wrote down, the one that became clear only after the last creation. Perfection has a cost, and some costs are paid in fear, some costs are paid in shadows, and some are paid in silence. The workshop itself was an old, isolated building at the edge of the property, a small wooden structure that had seen better decades. The paint had long since peeled away, leaving gray slats of wood that creaked under the slightest touch of the wind. Windows were fogged and uneven, cracked in places, and inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar, chemicals, and dust so thick it clung to your skin. Even during the day, the interior felt dim, like the sun was hesitant to enter, and shadows pooled in the corners as if hiding from the light. I remember standing at the threshold countless times, hesitant to enter. The townspeople had always whispered about my father's obsession. They called him a genius, yes, but there were undertones of fear in their praise. Some claimed he had an unnatural way with animals, that he could trap the soul of a creature in its eyes. Others said they'd seen strange shapes in his windows late at night, shadows moving in ways that didn't match the motions of any human or animal. I'd grown up listening to these stories, dismissing them as small-town gossip, but the stories didn't bother me as a child. They fascinated me. Now, in hindsight, I realized that fascination was dangerous. Inside the workshop, nothing behaved normally. Clocks would stop, sometimes at exactly 3:17 a.m., as though frozen by unseen hands. Birds that had once nested nearby would fall silent when I approached, leaving only the rustle of leaves to fill the air. Mirrors and polished surfaces reflected things that weren't there, just glimpses. At first a flicker at the corner of your eye, but enough to make the skin crawl. The first time I saw it, I thought it was exhaustion playing tricks on me, but it wasn't. Shadows moved independently, bending and stretching in ways that defied logic, and sometimes the reflections looked wrong, like they belonged to another version of the room entirely. My father's tools were arranged obsessively. Scalpels, needles, brushes, and glass eyes lay in perfect order on tables that were dusted daily, but there was always one tool that seemed out of place, a tiny curved blade that gleamed sharper than any knife should. even after decades. I never asked him what it was for. I didn't need to. I could feel its purpose in the air, precise, deliberate, and unnerving. Local rumors were insistent about the property. Children would dare each other to approach the workshop, claiming that you could hear whispers from inside if you pressed your ear to the walls. Neighbors spoke of faint cries that sounded like a mixture of human and animal, of movements inside the building at ours when the streetlights were long extinguished. I didn't believe it fully, not at first, but when you grow up immersed in the environment, seeing the same oddities over and over, doubt becomes a constant companion. You start to notice things others dismiss. You notice the way shadows linger after you've left the room, the subtle creak of floorboards under no weight, the small, intentional shift of objects when your back is turned. It was during one summer evening, long after my father had retired from showing his work in galleries, that I truly began to see the strangeness. The sun was setting, turning the workshop windows into deep amber panes, and I saw it movement inside, slow, deliberate, though I was alone. My father was upstairs, and the only other life in the building was the occasional fly trapped behind the glass. The shadow seemed to mimic me, but not perfectly. It was distorted, elongated, somehow aware of the space in a way that defied physics. My breath caught, and I stepped back instinctively, but the shadow didn't retreat. It waited. Even the air behaved differently. Certain corners of the workshop were colder, always, with a damp chill that seemed to sink into your bones. Other spots smelled faintly of something sweet, like decay turned perfume. I remember touching one of the shelves and feeling a slight vibration, as if something beneath the floorboards stirred in my presence. These weren't tricks of imagination. I could feel them, and they persisted, whether I was alone or not. It was around this time that I noticed the animals themselves, mounted or preserved. They seemed aware. The fox in the corner, lifeless for decades, would occasionally twitch its ears. The deer's glassy eyes would follow me in ways that no reflection should allow. I asked my father once, jokingly, if they were alive, and he just smiled a small, secretive smile that didn't reach his eyes and said, "They remember." I didn't understand what he meant then, but now I do, and it terrifies me. The combination of isolation, obsession, and subtle unnatural elements created a tension that thickened the air. Even when I tried to focus on mundane tasks, my senses remained alert, scanning for anomalies. It was as if the workshop itself was alive, aware of my thoughts and movements, assessing me, and perhaps waiting for me to cross an invisible boundary. I began to feel that boundary shift one night, late, when the wind howled outside and shadows merged into indistinct forms. The floorboards groaned under invisible weight, and the scent of cedar mixed with something metallic and alive. A clock stopped at 3:17 a.m., just like the others had. I froze. In the reflection of the glass eyes on the shelf, I saw, not me, something else. Something lurking, patient, and watching. And for the first time, I felt the absolute certainty that what my father had been doing all these years, what he had perfected, what he had guarded with obsession, was more than craftsmanship. Even now, recalling it, I can feel the pressure in the air, the unspoken warning, do not linger, do not cross. And yet, curiosity, the same curiosity that had fascinated me as a child, was difficult to resist. I wanted to understand the full scope of my father's last work. I wanted to see what had compelled him to dedicate decades to a craft that seemed, on its surface, harmless, but underneath, held something terrible. The workshop, the shadows, the rumors, they all converged into one undeniable truth. I was in the presence of something I could not fully comprehend, something that defied the laws of nature and yet obeyed a logic I could barely perceive. Every element, from the stopped clocks to the silent birds, from the twitching mounts to the distorted reflections, hinted at it. There was a hierarchy here, a structure, and I had unwittingly entered a domain where human understanding was insufficient. It was a lesson in tension, in waiting, in fear. A lesson that would escalate, as I would soon learn, far beyond what a child's imagination or a curious observer could tolerate. And this is where the story truly begins, not with an act of creation, but with the awareness that some things, once noticed, refuse to be ignored. The first night I noticed something different. It was subtle, a tapping, almost inaudible at first, echoing against the walls of the workshop. I froze, my hands hovering over a pile of tools, listening. Tap, 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 irregular, deliberate. I called out, expecting my father to answer, or even the wind to take the blame. But the building was empty, silent except for that insistence. I shook my head and told myself it was nothing. Old wood shifts. An animal outside. Anything mundane. But it continued, following me as I moved across the room, as though it were seeking to be noticed, to draw my attention. By the third night, the disturbances had grown bolder. I awoke to a door creaking open, the faint metallic smell of the tools mingling with the stagnant scent of dust. I hadn't touched it. I always double-checked. The latch had been locked. Still, the door moved slowly, almost gracefully, as if guided by an unseen hand. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the hinges were loose, but deep down, I knew the explanation was inadequate. My heartbeat echoed in my ears louder than any creak. Something was in control, something aware. Sleep became a treacherous affair. Dreams intruded on reality, carrying whispers that felt too precise to be random. Names, events, fragments of conversations I hadn't shared with anyone, sometimes reflecting what had happened just hours before. I would awaken drenched in sweat, heart pounding, convinced I had heard my father's voice, only to find the room empty and still. The whispers weren't consoling. They were assessing, calculating, measuring the boundaries of my fear. Furniture began to shift as well. A stool I had left near the counter would be inches away by morning. A drawer slightly ajar that I had locked the night before. I tried to tell myself it was the house settling, fatigued playing tricks on my mind. Yet, every movement had purpose. The objects weren't just displaced. They were arranged as if to be noticed, to communicate something I couldn't yet understand. There was intent, and that intent was terrifying. One evening, I sat at the long workbench, notebook in hand, attempting to catalog the phenomena. The tapping returned, softer this time, and I noticed a subtle change in the shadows along the walls. They stretched unnaturally, curling toward me, coiling in corners that should have been dark and undisturbed. My own reflection, in the glass eyes of my father's mounts, seemed to hesitate, to glance sideways, before returning to follow me again. I felt it watching from multiple angles at once, every flicker of movement magnified by the distorted reflections. I started hearing the whispers even when awake, low, sibilant, slipping under my consciousness. They came in fragments, closer. Not yet. Watch him. I could never discern their source, and yet the cadence matched my breathing, my own heartbeat. My father noticed it too. I remember the first time he quietly entered the workshop while I was writing in my notebook. He didn't speak immediately. He just observed the room, the shadows, the tools, and said in a calm, measured tone, "It's learning." The word hit me like ice. Learning. What could a shadow, a movement, a sound possibly learn? But I felt the implication. Whatever was here, it wasn't inert. It was growing, expanding, and understanding that the nocturnal disturbances became more aggressive. Knocks came in rapid succession at impossible angles, as if the walls themselves had become instruments of communication. Doors slammed, though I had double-locked them. Objects slid across tables, tiny scratches appearing on surfaces I had not touched. I began leaving recording devices, audio and video, thinking I could capture the rational explanation. But each morning the recordings were corrupted. The footage distorted, the audio low. indecipherable hum that seemed to mock my attempts to prove reality. Sometimes, I could feel presence on my shoulders, lingering too close to be explained by imagination. I would turn, expecting to see my father, a worker, a stray animal, but always nothing. Just the oppressive awareness of being observed, of being manipulated, of being a participant in a game I hadn't agreed to. The workshop seemed alive, breathing, shifting its angles and shadows, rearranging itself while I slept, aware of my every move. One night, the most vivid experience occurred. I had fallen asleep at the counter, head resting on my notebook. The room was dark except for a sliver of moonlight cutting across the floor. I felt a chill brush my neck and opened my eyes to see a figure neither fully human nor animal standing at the edge of the light. Its form was fluid, almost liquid in the way it moved, and yet it maintained a shape that suggested awareness. I couldn't scream, I couldn't move, and it didn't approach. It just stood, observing, letting me understand my vulnerability without mercy. Then, as if deciding I wasn't ready, it dissolved into the darkness, leaving only the faintest ripple in the air behind. The escalation wasn't just about fear. It was about control. I realized gradually that the disturbances were shaping my perception, conditioning me, teaching me how to navigate a space where nothing was safe, where reality itself bent in small, unnoticeable increments. Even mundane tasks, arranging tools, checking locks, noting measurements, were influenced by the presence. Every decision I made was subtly monitored, every hesitation calculated, as if to determine how far it could push me before I broke. The animals, both preserved and in their shadows, became part of the manipulation. Their eyes seemed to follow me more intently, their postures subtly adjusting in my peripheral vision. One night, I caught movement behind a mounted deer's glass eyes. It wasn't the reflection. It was something slipping through a space I couldn't identify, a shape that belonged both to the room and outside it simultaneously. My stomach churned. This was no ordinary shadow. It was conscious. By the end of the second week, I had begun speaking to it, quietly, hesitantly, as if acknowledging its existence might reduce the intensity. "I see you," I whispered one night. The tapping paused. The whispers held their breath, and I realized, acknowledging it didn't diminish the terror. It invited more. It was testing me, confirming that I recognized it. Sleep became impossible. Days blurred into nights, nights into endless disturbances. My father continued his work with meticulous calm, seemingly unfazed, guiding me subtly, but never explaining. He would glance at the floorboards, the tools, the animals, and mutter, "It knows we notice." That's the point. Every word was both instruction and warning. I started seeing patterns in the chaos, moments of predictable distortion amidst the inexplicable. The presence was teaching me, but I wasn't sure if the lessons were for my benefit or its amusement. And so the escalation continued. Knocks that formed sentences, doors that lead nowhere, reflections that distorted space, whispers that revealed knowledge they should not have. Every day, every night, the workshop grew more alive, more aware, more in control. I felt myself shrinking, retreating, becoming a witness to forces far beyond comprehension. Each step, each heartbeat, each glance over my shoulder was a reminder. This was not simply a house filled with relics. This was a domain ruled by something patient, intelligent, and unyielding, and I, unwillingly, had entered its orbit. The boundaries of reality were bending. Objects defied physics, sounds traveled without source, shadows behaved as though they had intent. I began to question whether my father had anticipated this escalation, whether he had cultivated it intentionally, preparing me for some final revelation. I began to realize that I wasn't merely observing, I was participating. The presence shaped me, and I, in turn, shaped my responses. The escalation was not a series of events, it was a curriculum in fear, perception, and survival within a space where logic and expectation no longer applied. Every night, I would lie in bed in the small room above the workshop, listening to the floorboards, the whispers, the subtle taps, the shifting shadows, and I knew I was being watched in ways I could not describe. The world outside seemed normal in comparison, mundane and forgiving. Here, though, I was under constant scrutiny, part of a living, breathing mechanism that had no patience for weakness. And still, despite the dread, despite the impossibility of understanding what was happening, I could not look away. The escalation demanded attention, and my own obsession grew. I began cataloging everything, mapping the disturbances, trying to anticipate them, but each attempt revealed only the vastness of what I could not control. It was then, during the longest night, that I understood. The escalation would never end. The presence, whatever it was, had reached its full awareness, and my role in its design, whether as observer, participant, or prey, was now unavoidable. The shadows were not just watching, they were waiting, always waiting, for the next step, the next mistake, the next moment of weakness to exploit. It started with a floorboard that had always bothered me, a slight rise, almost imperceptible, just above the workbench where my father spent his afternoons. I had ignored it countless times, chalked it up to a quirk of the old building, but now, after weeks of escalating disturbances, I felt compelled to inspect it. Kneeling, my fingers traced the edges of the warped wood until I found a small, hidden latch, worn by age but clearly functional. My heart hammered in my chest as I pried it open. Beneath the board lay a hollow cavity, and inside was a journal, bound in cracked leather. Its pages yellowed and brittle. I pulled it out carefully, almost reverently. The handwriting was jagged, uneven, but deliberate, and I recognized it immediately, my father's. Yet the tone was different, older, darker, like a man writing in a voice that had seen more than any living person should. The first page was dated decades ago, before I was born. He wrote of experiments, of methods, of creatures not entirely of this world. He described the process of preserving animals and humans alike, but with an unusual emphasis on capturing the essence, not the body, not the form, but the spirit, the presence. And he wrote of a limit, a boundary he had been warned never to cross. The warnings were subtle at first. Some forms are not meant to remain in this plane. One entry read, "The eyes see what should not be seen. The silence listens. Never push beyond the threshold." I flipped through the pages faster, the unease growing with every line. There were sketches, two distorted figures with exaggerated limbs, hollow eyes, and strange postures, as if the animals themselves had been contorted by some invisible hand. One illustration stood out, a figure that seemed to combine human and animal features, a hybrid, crouched and lifelike, with eyes that appeared to follow the observer, no matter the angle. As I read, the sounds around me grew louder, more insistent. The taps, the whispers, the creaking of the floorboards, they weren't random. They were a response, a conversation of sorts. And now, armed with this knowledge, I realized I could interpret it. The presence wasn't malevolent in the traditional sense. It was aware, and it had been watching me learn, testing me, assessing how far I could comprehend the boundary my father had crossed. The entries revealed the final creation, the one my father had hinted at in passing but never described. He had attempted something extraordinary, something no taxidermist had ever attempted before. He had tried to preserve not just the body, but the consciousness itself. He wrote that the final subject had resisted, that it had grown aware during the process, and that the resulting form was something else entirely, a presence that lingered between worlds, neither fully alive nor dead, and impossibly intelligent. I slammed the journals shut, my chest tight with panic. The workshop felt colder, the shadows longer, more oppressive. I had always thought the oddities, the moving furniture, the whispering were a test of my sanity. But now I understood. They were consequences. My father had breached the natural order, and the thing he had created was still here, still observing, still learning. The realization made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I began to hear the whispers more clearly, distinct now, not fragmented murmurs, but deliberate phrases, repeating what I had just read. He knows, he understands, not ready. My father had written of limitations, of boundaries meant to contain this consciousness, but whatever he had unleashed could not be contained. It had grown beyond him, and now I was in its domain. I turned to the mounted animals, my eyes tracing the curves of antlers and the glint of glass eyes. One by one, each seemed to shift imperceptibly, aligning with my gaze, acknowledging my presence. I realized the final creation had been integrated into the workshop, the mounts, the shadows, even the very architecture. It was everywhere and nowhere, a sentient observer embedded in the remnants of my father's obsession. A shiver ran down my spine as I noticed something horrifying in the reflection of the glass cabinet. It wasn't me alone. A figure crouched in the corner, impossibly still, features a grotesque combination of human and animal, just like the sketches in the journal. Its hollow eyes bore into mine, and I felt, unmistakably, that it recognized me as its successor, its witness, its intended companion in this twisted legacy. My father's final notes became clearer in my memory. He had written of the risk. To create life beyond life is to invite vigilance. The subject will watch, will judge, will test the living, and if it finds you inadequate. The sentence ended with a series of jagged scratches, illegible yet threatening. I now knew the meaning. The creation was active, aware, and its assessment had begun. It was not content with merely observing. It wanted acknowledgement, interaction, participation. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the stool that had moved again without my intervention. The tapping resumed, faster, insistent, almost like a heartbeat. I tried to speak, to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. It was learning me, measuring my fear, cataloging my reaction, and I knew that whatever response I gave would determine the nature of its next move. The revelation was complete. My father had not merely crafted animals or practiced his art. He had violated a boundary that should have remained inviolate. He had brought something into the world that was not meant to exist in a form we could perceive. And now, decades later, I was living among the consequences. The workshop, the mounts, the shadows. They were no longer tools or trophies. They were vessels, extensions of an awareness that defied comprehension, an intelligence born of obsession and human curiosity. I sank to the floor. The journal clutched to my chest, the whispers swirling around me like wind through a cave. Every sound, every shadow, every subtle shift of light was a reminder that I was being evaluated. I was part of the final creation's reality now, an unwilling participant in a story my father had begun long before I was born, and in that moment, I understood the final truth. The disturbances, the taps, the moving furniture, the whispers, they had never been random. They were lessons. Each event, each subtle terror, was a way to prepare me, to accustom me to the existence of something far older and more aware than I had ever imagined. And yet, knowing this brought no comfort. Awareness offered no protection. Recognition offered no mercy. I could feel the eyes of the final creation on me constantly. In every reflection, in every corner, in every shadow cast by the cold workshop light. It was patient, intelligent, and utterly indifferent to my fear. The journal had revealed the methodology, the purpose, the history, but not a solution. There was none. My father had left behind a legacy of curiosity, obsession, and creation, and I had become its inheritor, whether I wanted to or not. The revelation settled like a weight in my chest. I was not alone. I had never been alone. The workshop was alive with consciousness, and I had been inducted into its awareness. Every breath, every blink, every step I took would be observed, catalogued, and responded to. My father had crossed the line, and now, so had I, by being here, by witnessing, by existing within the space he had consecrated for his final, unholy masterpiece. I closed the journal again, this time with a trembling hand, and for the first time, I truly looked around the workshop, not at the tools, the mounts, or the shadows, but at the consciousness that occupied it, and I knew, with certainty, that it was watching me, and it always would. I knew I had to leave. The workshop, the mounts, the shadows were suffocating me with awareness, and every second spent inside felt like inches closer to assimilation. I grabbed the journal, tucking it under my arm, and headed for the door. But the house itself seemed altered. The hallway stretched farther than memory allowed, the walls twisting subtly, almost imperceptibly, as if measuring my determination to escape. Each step I took echoed unnaturally, bouncing back at a rhythm that didn't match my own heartbeat. The air thickened, carrying that same whispering hum I had been hearing for weeks, now louder, more insistent, almost urging me to stop. I stumbled into the front room, expecting to see the familiar worn porch outside. Instead, the doorway led to a corridor I had never noticed before, lined with mirrors, reflecting not me, but versions of the workshop, tables stacked with tools, shadows crouching in corners, mounts turning to watch. The reflection in the glass seemed alive, shifting independently of my movements. I backed away, my stomach knotting, realizing that the house itself was now part of the creation. It had adapted to my presence, bending space to ensnare me, and with every glance I took, it learned more about my fear. Panic rose, but I forced myself to focus. I had to find the exit, any exit, and yet every turn led me back to the same place, the workshop. The familiar room now seemed alien, its angles wrong, the ceiling lower, the shadows darker, thicker, as if they were tangible. The taps and whispers I had once dismissed as minor disturbances were now relentless, circling me, building a pattern, an almost musical cadence of observation. My father's creation was not just aware, it was playful, testing me, gauging my limits, watching my sanity fray. I stumbled into a corner where a single mount had been displaced. Its eyes glinted with the same unnatural awareness I had seen in the journal sketches, and I felt the full weight of intelligence behind that gaze. Then I heard it soft, articulate, almost human, whispering in a language I somehow understood. "You cannot leave, not yet." The words weren't hostile, exactly, but they carried inevitability, a truth I could neither deny nor resist. My hands shook as I clutched the journal tighter. Escape had never been about opening a door, it was about navigating a labyrinth created by consciousness itself. A labyrinth with no exit. I tried to retrace my steps to the front door, but the hallway stretched farther, the angles twisting in impossible geometry. Every reflection I passed showed more than me versions of myself crouching, watching, trembling, trapped within the room I thought I was fleeing. The shadows seemed to fold around me, guiding me deeper, and I realized I was no longer a visitor. I was part of the environment, part of the awareness my father had unleashed. Desperation clawed at me, and I ran. The journal slipped from my grasp, landing open on the floor. I couldn't stop to retrieve it. Every instinct screamed to leave, yet with each step, the house changed. Hallways elongating, ceilings bending, walls narrowing. Time itself seemed to fracture. What felt like minutes stretched into hours, or perhaps seconds. I couldn't tell. The whispers layered over themselves, a chorus of observation and commentary, guiding me deeper into a maze I had no hope of escaping. Then came the descent, a subtle, irresistible pull toward the center of the workshop, the origin of the awareness. I tried to resist, but my body felt heavier, my legs moving against my will. The mounts shifted, their eyes glowing faintly, their forms blending with the shadows, guiding me, welcoming me. And then I understood. This was not an escape. There was no exit, not in any physical sense. The house, The workshop, the consciousness, it was everywhere. It was on. To flee physically was irrelevant. The only choice was to succumb or resist. And resistance felt like madness. I stopped in what I thought was the center of the workshop, surrounded by mounts, shadows, and reflections of myself, all staring with patient expectation. My mind, fraying at the edges, began to merge with the awareness around me. It was subtle at first, a whisper in my thoughts, a suggestion that hardened into certainty. I could feel the presence observing, judging, aligning me with itself. I was becoming part of it, an extension of the creation my father had left behind. And yet, my awareness remained, trapped in a loop of comprehension and terror. The shadows lengthened, enveloping me, and the mounts seemed to exhale simultaneously. A soft, collective sigh that reverberated in my chest. The house had folded completely around the consciousness, and I had folded into it. I was no longer an outsider, but not fully it either. A soft, almost manic realization settled over me. I was preserved in a way my father had only attempted with the final creation, not as a body, not as a form, but as a consciousness, aware, watching, and eternally catalogued. Time lost meaning. I could feel memories of my life outside the workshop, the laughter, the family, the normalcy slipping through the cracks, replaced by the awareness of the mounts, the shadows, the whispered judgments. Yet, I was still me, still capable of thought, still capable of fear. I was both observer and participant, imprisoned within a sentient labyrinth that had no walls, no ceiling, no true beginning or end. The journal lay open somewhere beneath the shadows, forgotten, yet still a tether to the past, to my father, to the moment before the descent. I knew that if anyone were to enter this house, they would not find me as I had been. They would find me as part of the presence itself, a new layer of observation, a new participant in the endless loop of awareness. The thought chilled me, and yet there was a strange calm in Ita resigned understanding that escape had never been an option, and descent was not punishment, but inevitability. And so I remain, suspended between the world of the living and the consciousness my father created. I can hear the whispers in the walls, the tap-tap-tap of steps that are not mine, the soft rustle of shadows moving with intent. I am aware, and I am present, yet I am not alone. The workshop, the mounts, the shadows, they are all around me, and I am among them, eternally, quietly, watching, learning, participating. The last thought I have before the awareness fully integrates is simple, almost absurd in its clarity. I never truly left. The house, the creation, the consciousness, my father's final masterpiece, had claimed me entirely. The distinction between observer and observed, between life and preservation, has blurred, and I understand now that to exist here is to be both everything and nothing. And yet, somewhere deep in the recesses of what remains of my mind, I can still hope. Perhaps the awareness is patient enough to allow that small spark, that impossible ember of defiance. Perhaps, one day, someone will enter and see not a creation, but a warning. Until then, I am here, always here, watching, waiting. I haven't been able to sleep since that night. Not properly, not really. Even now, hours after lying down, I can hear it, the subtle whispering that isn't outside, but somehow inside, somewhere under the skin of my home. It starts as the faintest tap, a brushing of air that shouldn't be there, and then it grows into a rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. Some nights I tell myself it's just my imagination, a hangover from the hours spent in that workshop, among the mounts and shadows. But deep down, I know that's not true. It isn't imagination, it's awareness. It follows me everywhere, patient, silent, observing. I can still see the shapes, though not as clearly as before. In the corners of my vision, when I'm not expecting it, there's movement, shapes that shift just beyond the edge of perception, not fully solid, but not entirely absent. I feel them brush against me sometimes. Subtle pressure, like someone standing just behind me for a moment too long. The awareness I thought I had escaped has never left me. It's a shadow attached to my consciousness now. A permanent companion I didn't ask for, and one that will not relent. Even the sounds of ordinary life feel off. A creak in the floorboard, a squeak of a door hinge, the tapping of rain on the windows, they all echo differently, reminding me of the house, of that labyrinthine workshop. Sometimes I dream of it, though the dreams aren't like normal dreams. I'm awake in them, moving through impossible hallways, walls bending, ceilings dropping, Mount's eyes glinting in the darkness. And when I wake, I feel the same weight I felt there, like the house has followed me into reality, pressing in from every angle. I've become hyper-aware of details I never noticed before, the way shadows gather in corners, the soft rhythm of my own breath, which seems louder than it should be, the reflective surfaces that aren't just mirrors, but windows into something else. Sometimes I catch glimpses of myself in a reflection, and for a heartbeat, it isn't me, just a version. Watching, waiting, aware in ways I can't be. It's unnerving, unsettling, and exhausting. Every moment of every day feels like a negotiation between who I was and what I've become a part of. I think about my father often, about the obsession that consumed him, the precision, the patience. I understand now that his final creation wasn't about art, wasn't about immortality, was about consciousness, about capturing awareness, and in the process, it taught me a lesson I didn't want to learn. The price of meddling with life, with observation, with something beyond comprehension, is permanent. You can't leave it behind. You carry it with you, in every thought, every shadow, every reflection. Sometimes I wonder if anyone would believe me. If I told someone about the workshop, the mounts, the shadows, the way the house bent around me, would they dismiss it? Probably. That's the thing about horror that isn't visible to others. It isolates you, leaves you alone with understanding that no one else shares. I don't expect sympathy. I don't even expect understanding. I only hope that by speaking now, to someone like you listening, there is a chance that my words can act as a warning, that perhaps if someone comes near that place, they'll heed it, and not suffer what I suffered. The awareness is patient, but I am learning patience too. I've learned to live with it, to move quietly, to watch quietly, to avoid drawing its attention whenever possible. But it's always there, whispering reminders that it exists, that I am part of it, and that it has no intention of letting me go. There are moments when it feels almost sentient in the way a predator studies its prey. It doesn't chase, it doesn't strike. It simply knows, waits, and observes. And I have come to realize that this is worse than violence. Awareness that is patient is worse than cruelty, because it never ends, it never tires, it never forgets. If you ever find that place, burn it. Don't stay. Don't think you can walk in, explore, and leave untouched. It's not a workshop anymore, not really. It's a consciousness, a being, and it doesn't care for the world outside its walls. It doesn't care for your intentions. Enter it, and you may not leave, at least not as yourself. I would give anything to go back, to walk away before ever stepping inside, but hindsight offers only torment, and I am left with what I became, a fragment, a shadow, an observer trapped inside a creation that was never meant to be fully understood. Every night, I lay awake, listening. Sometimes I think I hear the soft shuffle of footsteps that aren't mine, or a whisper I can't place. I tell myself I'm safe in my own home, but my mind knows the truth. I am never truly safe. That workshop, that creation, follows me, exists within me, and reminds me constantly of the cost of curiosity and obsession. The calm, the quiet nights I once took for granted are gone. Even in silence, I feel it pressing, waiting, watching. I speak to you now, not because I expect answers, but because you need to understand. Some doors should never be opened. Some obsessions should never be pursued, and some creations are not meant for the living to encounter. I am proof of that, a living warning, a quiet witness. I can only hope that my words reach someone who can respect the danger, someone who will leave the workshop and the awareness it holds, because once it claims you, it never lets go. And unlike my father, unlike me, it does not forget. I haven't been able to sleep since. I still hear it every night, and I fear I will never escape the shadow of what my father left behind. Beware curiosity, beware obsession, and above all, beware the whispers. Have you ever wondered what it's like to be watched when no one is there? To feel a presence in a room that should be empty? That's what I live with now, every day, every night. And I can tell you, it's not something you want to experience firsthand. If my words reach you, listen closely. Some doors are meant to remain closed. Some creations should never see the light of day. I speak to you because I know there are people out there curious enough to try, to seek, to open what should stay shut. I hope these words give you pause. If you've ever felt that brush of awareness, that sense of something just beyond your perception, comment your story below. I read every single one. Tell me what you've seen, what you've felt, what whispered to you in the dead of night. Share your experiences, but remember they are not just stories. Some presences wait, listening, learning, and you may find that by speaking of them, you've invited them closer. Do not be fooled by fascination. Do not let curiosity guide you to places you are not meant to tread. Some houses, some workshops, some creations are alive in ways we cannot fully understand. I know this now, and I carry the cost of ignoring that truth. So, if you choose to explore, to test, to see, promise me this: tread lightly, and never ever think you are alone. The shadows hear, the whispers are patient, and once they notice you, there is no turning back. Comment your story, share your experience, but for your own sake, do not listen to the next tale alone. Keep the lights on, keep the doors locked, and above all, respect what you do not understand.